The burial was on a Friday, and by Sunday, my son was already talking about real estate. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I was married to my wife for 41 years. 41 years of Sunday morning coffee on the back porch, of her reading to me from whatever book she had going, of her voice filling every corner of every room we ever lived in together. Her name was Ruth. She was 63 years old when the cancer took her, and she was still the most stubborn, sharp-minded, quietly brilliant woman I had ever known right up until the last morning. I am 66. I spent 30 years as a Finnish carpenter before my knees gave out. My hands are not smooth. I am not a man who is easy to surprise, because I spent most of my life reading wood grain and understanding the difference between what something looks like on the surface and what it actually is underneath. My son did not know that about me. Or maybe he forgot. I should tell you about him. His name is Marcus, and he is 38 years old. And he is not a bad person in the way that a person who hurts animals or steals from strangers is a bad person. He is bad in the quieter, more comfortable way that some people become when they have been given just enough their whole lives to believe they deserve more. He grew up in a good house. He went to a good school. His mother and I paid for most of college. When he got married 6 years ago, we gave him and his wife Cassandra $20,000 to put toward a down payment on their first home. I mention all of that not to ask for gratitude. I mention it because it matters to understand the kind of person Marcus is. He received all of those things and cataloged none of them. In his mind, they were simply things that had happened to him, like weather. His wife Cassandra is 35 and works in corporate risk management, which, from what I can tell, means she spends her days calculating how to protect assets and minimize losses. I think that training extended into her personal life. Every conversation with Cassandra felt like a negotiation she had already decided the outcome of before you sat down. The two of them drove up from Atlanta on the Thursday before the funeral. I was glad to have help, genuinely glad, because there is a particular loneliness to making phone calls about burial arrangements, and I was grateful not to be doing all of it alone. For 2 days they were good. They were present. Marcus cried at the graveside, and I believe those tears were real. It was Sunday afternoon, the day after we buried Ruth, when Cassandra sat down across from me at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil, and a look on her face that I recognized immediately. She had been to the house before, of course, many times, but something in the way she moved through it that afternoon was different. She was measuring. My son sat beside her with his hands folded on the table. The house we are talking about is a craftsman bungalow in East Nashville, 3 bedrooms, just over 1,200 square feet, on a corner lot with a tulip poplar in the front yard that Ruth planted herself 22 years ago. The neighborhood has changed considerably in the last decade. Houses on our block are selling for things that would have seemed like a misprint when we bought it. We bought it for $87,000 in 2001. I know what it's worth now. So did Cassandra. "Dad," Marcus said, leaning forward a little, "we've been thinking." I looked at him. I waited. He said they had been concerned about me, about how I would manage. He said the house was a lot of upkeep for one person, that the yard alone was significant, that the stairs to the second bedroom had always been steep, that the neighborhood was getting noisier with all the development. He said it in that particular way people have when they are delivering a conclusion they reached a long time ago and dressing it up as a conversation. "We found some really lovely communities," Cassandra said. She slid a piece of paper across the table. I did not look at it. She said, "There's one in Smyrna that has a waiting list, but we think we could get you on it." I said, "What kind of community?" She smiled. She said, "Senior independent living, beautiful facilities, social activities. They have a wood shop." I nodded slowly. I said, "And the house?" Marcus said, "We could help manage the sale. Cassandra knows a realtor. Given the market right now, you'd walk away with more than enough to cover the community fees for years." I looked at my son. He was watching me with an expression I can only describe as practiced. It had the shape of concern, but the texture of something else entirely. I thought about Ruth. I thought about the last conversation we had, 3 weeks before she died, In the small hours of a Tuesday morning when neither of us could sleep, and she had taken my hand in hers and said, "George, listen to me carefully." I said to Marcus and Cassandra, "Let me think about it." Cassandra clicked her mechanical pencil twice. She said, "Of course. Take all the time you need." They left on Monday morning. I stood on the front porch and watched them back out of the driveway, and I was already thinking about the phone call I needed to make. Let me tell you about my wife. Ruth grew up in Harlan County, Kentucky. Her family had owned land there for 4 generations. 112 acres of eastern Kentucky hillside, with a creek running through the lower third of it, and a stand of white oak on the ridge that her grandfather had refused to sell to the timber companies twice, once in the 50s and once in the 80s. Her parents were gone. Her brother had moved to Oregon 20 years ago and had no interest in the property. The land had passed to Ruth entirely when her mother died 8 years back. I had been to that land exactly 6 times in our marriage. Ruth went every summer by herself, sometimes for 2 or 3 weeks. She would come back quieter and more settled than she had left. She loved it in a way that was almost private, almost separate from me, and I understood that and respected it. She had grown up with the sound of that creek. What I did not fully understand until the conversation she and I had 3 weeks before she died was the extent to which she had been planning. "George," she said, "I've taken care of some things." She squeezed my hand. She said, "I need you to trust me, and I need you to not say anything to Marcus until the time is right." She told me to call her attorney when I was ready. She told me his name was Daniel Pritchard, and that his office was in Lexington, and that he had been holding a sealed envelope from her for the past 14 months. She said, "Cassandra is going to try to manage you." She said it without anger, just with the clear, matter-of-fact tone she used when she was stating something she had observed and verified. She said, "Let her think she is," then called Daniel. She closed her eyes. I sat with her in the dark. I waited 3 weeks after the funeral before I called Daniel Pritchard. I needed that time. I needed to grieve properly, and I needed to think clearly, and I also needed to have a few more conversations with my son so that I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. Marcus called me twice that first week. The calls had a structure to them. He would ask how I was doing. I would say I was managing, and then after a few minutes, the conversation would find its way back to the house. He mentioned twice that spring was a good time to list. He mentioned once that the longer I waited, the more I would be asking buyers to do the work of imagining themselves in a space that was. And here he paused. That was so specifically Mom's. I let him talk. I said things like, "You're probably right, and I hear you, and I'll give it serious thought." On the 8th day after the funeral, Cassandra sent me a spreadsheet. It was a detailed breakdown of the projected sale price of the East Nashville house, estimated closing costs, the monthly fee structure at the Smyrna community, and a projected timeline showing that if I listed by May 1st, I could be in the community by July. At the bottom of the spreadsheet, there was a section labeled Additional Assets, where she had listed my pension, my Social Security estimate, and a line that said Ruth's estate to be verified. I stared at that last line for a long time. To be verified. She did not know. Neither of them knew. And the reason they didn't know was that Ruth had never talked about the Harlan County land with Marcus in any meaningful way. She had mentioned it occasionally over the years in passing, the way you might mention a place you used to go. In his mind, if he thought about it at all, it was probably a scrubby patch of old Kentucky hills with no road access and minimal value. He had never been there. He had never asked to go. He did not know about the lease agreement. 6 years ago, a renewable energy company had approached Ruth about a long-term lease on the ridge portion of the property for a small wind installation. Ruth had consulted with 3 attorneys and a land use specialist before she agreed. She negotiated hard. The lease was 30 years, with renewal options, and it generated a payment of $26,000 per year, indexed to inflation. She had been quietly depositing those payments into an account I did not have my name on, because she wanted to protect it. She said she wanted it clean and separate and fully documented in her name alone until she could transfer it properly. She had been doing that for 6 years. The account had a balance of $163,000. The land itself, according to the most recent appraisal Daniel Pritchard had commissioned, was valued at $340,000 based on the existing lease income and the remaining timber value on the lower parcels. Ruth had amended her will 14 months before she died. Everything passed directly to me. The Harlan County property, the lease account, a small investment account she had opened with inherited money from her mother that I had honestly forgotten about, totaling another $48,000. Daniel Pritchard had filed the paperwork. It was done. It had been done for over a year. All of it bypassed the estate entirely. All of it was already mine. I called Daniel Pritchard on a Thursday morning in late March, standing in Ruth's garden with a cup of coffee getting cold in my hand. He was a calm, careful man in his 60s with a quiet voice and the kind of measured competence that made you feel immediately that everything was going to be handled correctly. He confirmed everything Ruth had told me. He said he was sorry for my loss. He said Ruth had been very thorough and very clear about her intentions. He said she had anticipated, and here he paused, that there might be some external pressure on my decision-making in the period following her death. I said, she was usually right about things like that. He said, yes, that was my impression of her as well. He told me there was nothing I needed to do urgently. Everything was legally established. The transition of assets had been structured to occur automatically upon her death, with documentation already filed. He told me to take my time, live my life, and call him if anything complicated arose. I thanked him and hung up and stood in the garden for a while. The tulip poplar in the front yard was just beginning to bud. Ruth had planted it as a sapling she'd brought back from her mother's property in a plastic bag of damp soil. The summer of the year Marcus graduated high school. She had chosen that spot carefully, pacing off distances from the property line and the water main and the power lines. She knew exactly what she was doing. She always knew exactly what she was doing. Marcus called the following Tuesday. By this point, his tone had changed slightly. The gentleness was still there, but it had a new edge under it, a small impatience, the way a person sounds when they have been expecting a specific answer and are becoming confused that it hasn't arrived yet. Dad, he said, have you had a chance to think more about the house? I said, I've been thinking about it a lot, actually. He said, and? I said, you know, I've been looking at those numbers Cassandra sent. I think you all might be right. There was a silence. Then his voice shifted, became warmer again, more familiar. He said, I'm really glad, Dad. I know it's hard. I know what the house means. But I really do think this is going to be better for you. I said, the thing is, I want to handle this the right way. I want to make sure everything goes smoothly. Could you and Cassandra come up this weekend? I'd like to sit down together and talk through the details. He said, of course. He said, absolutely. He said they would be there Saturday. I spent the next 4 days doing very little except sitting in the house and moving through it slowly, room by room, the way you do when you are deciding what something means to you. I sat in Ruth's reading chair in the corner of the bedroom. I ate dinner at the kitchen table with the chair across from me empty. I went down to the basement and stood in front of my workbench and looked at the cabinet I had been building her for the back hallway, still unfinished, still needing its final sanding and its hinges. I finished the cabinet. I don't know why, exactly. It felt like something that needed to be completed. On Friday night, I called my oldest friend, a man named Warren, who I had known since we were both apprentice carpenters in 1982, who lived now in a small house outside Cookville, and who had never once, in 44 years of friendship, given me bad advice when I actually asked for it. I told him the whole story. He listened without interrupting, which is one of his best qualities. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Ruth set this whole thing up? I said, yes. He said, Lord have mercy, she was something else. I said, she was. He asked what I was going to do. I told him. He laughed, a long, low laugh that I hadn't heard from him in a while, and he said, George, you let me know how that goes. Marcus and Cassandra arrived Saturday morning. They had driven up from Atlanta again, and this time there was an energy between them that I recognized as the specific alertness of people who are close to getting something they want. Cassandra was dressed like she was going to a meeting. She had a leather portfolio. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. I said I had been doing a lot of thinking. I said it was hard, being in the house, that they were right, that it was too much, that every room had so much of Ruth in it that some mornings I could barely move through them without stopping. That part was true. I said it plainly, and Marcus reached across the table and put his hand on my arm, and I could see that he meant it and that he also wanted this conversation to proceed efficiently. Cassandra said, "We think this is really the right move, Dad." I noticed she had started calling me that recently. She had not always done that. I said, "I've been thinking about the house specifically, about what you said, and I think I want to transfer it directly to you, both of you, rather than going through a sale." Cassandra's pen stopped. Marcus said, "What?" I said, "A gift deed. I've talked to someone about it. It's cleaner. No realtor, no closing costs. It would go directly to you. You can do what you want with it. Sell it, keep it, whatever makes sense." Marcus looked at Cassandra. Something passed between them that they tried to keep out of their faces and did not entirely succeed. He said, "Dad, you don't have to do that." I said, "I know I don't have to. I want to. The house is going to need some work. I should tell you that up front. The roof has maybe 3 years on it. I want to be honest with you. And there's been some settling in the foundation on the east side that I've been monitoring. A contractor looked at it last fall. He said it was manageable, but it would need to be addressed. Probably 60 to 80,000 to do it right." I watched Cassandra's pen move slightly on her legal pad. I saw her adjust something. I kept going. I said, "The HVAC is original. The electrical in the basement workshop is not up to current code, which means any buyer is going to flag it on inspection. I want you to go in with clear eyes." Marcus said, "Are these all things that would affect the sale price?" I said, "Significantly." He said, "How significantly?" I said I'd had a rough estimate done. I said the honest number after repairs and commission, if they went the sale route, was probably 230 to 250. Maybe a little more if they got lucky with a buyer who didn't look too hard. Cassandra wrote something down. I could not see what it was. I said, "So, if you want it, it's yours. I'll talk to a real estate attorney this week. We can have the deed transferred inside of 30 days. Marcus looked at me. He said, "And you're sure about this?" I said, "Son, I've never been more sure of anything." He reached over and hugged me. It was a long hug, and I let it be long. I patted him on the back. Over his shoulder, I could see Cassandra making a small, controlled smile at her legal pad. We had lunch. They stayed until mid-afternoon. When they left, Cassandra hugged me too and called me Dad again and said, "We're going to take such good care of this place." I said, "I know you will." I watched them pull away down the street, and then I went inside and sat in Ruth's chair, and I said out loud to the empty room, "How am I doing?" I could almost hear her answer. The deed transfer took 22 days. My real estate attorney, a quiet woman in her 50s named Patricia, who came recommended by Daniel Pritchard, handled everything efficiently. She asked me once, privately, whether I was certain about this decision. I told her yes. She nodded and went back to the paperwork. The day the transfer was finalized, I called Marcus. I told him it was done. He said, "Dad, this means everything to us. It really does." He said they were going to take the summer to think about what they wanted to do with it. He said Cassandra had been in touch with a contractor friend of hers about the foundation estimate. I wished him luck. 2 days later, I loaded my truck. I did not take everything. I took my tools, my good books, the cabinet from the back hallway that I had finally finished, the box of photographs from the bedroom closet, Ruth's favorite quilt, the cast iron skillet she had used every Sunday morning for 20 years, and the small clay pot she kept on the kitchen windowsill, with the broken handle she had never gotten around to replacing, because she said the crack ran right and gave it character. I drove east on I-40 and then north on 75 and then off onto state roads that got smaller and slower as the hills got bigger. I had driven this route exactly once before, 6 years ago, when Ruth had asked me to come with her and I had said yes, in the way you say yes to things that matter to the person you love more than anyone. Harlan County looked the way I remembered it. Green and steep and older than the rest of the country somehow. Like the hills had been set down before the rest of it was figured out, and never asked permission from anyone afterward. The roads narrowed to 2 lanes, and then the 2 lanes to 1, and then the 1 lane to a gravel track that climbed through second-growth forest until the tree line opened and I was on the ridge. The farmhouse had been used by Ruth's family as a seasonal place for decades. It needed work. Of course it needed work. Ruth had known that and had left detailed notes in the envelope with Daniel Pritchard about what needed doing first. New water pump, chimney inspection, rewire the kitchen circuits. She had already gotten estimates. She had already identified a local contractor she trusted. I sat on the front porch in a wooden chair that her grandfather had made, and I looked out at the ridge and the valley below it, and the small silver line of the creek in the late afternoon light. On the lower pasture, 300 yards down the hill, I could see the base of the wind installation. They were quiet, those turbines. People imagine them louder than they are. They turned slowly in the April wind and made almost no sound that I could hear from where I was sitting. I thought about calling Warren, but I didn't. I just sat there. After a while, the light changed, and the valley went dark from the bottom up, and the sky stayed bright longer than you'd expect. I thought about Ruth, sitting in this exact spot. I thought about her sitting here alone every summer, reading her books and watching this same sky, carrying this place in her the way she carried the rest of her private, precise, deeply considered life. She had known a long time before I did what was coming, what the shape of it would be, what Marcus and Cassandra would eventually ask for, and how they would ask for it, and what the consequences would be if I simply let it happen. She had known, and she had spent 14 months doing something about it, quietly, without telling me until she had to, because she knew I would have argued with her, or told her it wouldn't come to that, or some other well-meaning, useless thing. She had protected me the way she always protected me. By simply doing the work. I want to be clear about one thing. I do not want you to think this story is about money. The money matters because money is what my son came for. And it matters because the difference between having it and not having it is the difference between being able to live on my own terms and being managed. But I did not sit on that porch feeling triumphant. I sat there feeling the particular heaviness of a man who has just put 41 years of his life in the ground and is trying to figure out what the next part looks like. What I felt, underneath everything else, was grateful. Grateful in a way that made my chest hurt. She had done all of this for me. She had sat with a Lexington attorney in the middle of her cancer treatments and amended her will and set up the trust documents and arranged the estate so that the life we had made together could not simply be dissolved by someone else's spreadsheet. She had done it while she was sick. She had done it while she was scared. She had done it without complaining to me about it or asking me to carry any of it with her. That is the kind of woman she was. The first week I was in Harlan County, I mostly worked. The water pump needed replacing, and I replaced it. I found a local electrician named Boyd, who had worked on the house before and knew its particular problems, and we spent 2 days on the kitchen circuits. I cleared brush from the near fence line. I found Ruth's notes in the farmhouse, pages of her handwriting in the blue notebooks she always used, and I read them carefully and followed them like a map. Boyd asked me one afternoon, while we were eating sandwiches on the tailgate of my truck, if I'd lived in Kentucky before. I said no. I said my wife grew up near here. He said, "She passed recently?" I said yes. He said, "I'm sorry for that." He said it simply, without performance, the way people in that part of the country still sometimes say difficult things. He went back to his sandwich. That evening I called Warren and told him where I was and how things had gone. He said, "So Marcus got the house." I said, "He got a house." Warren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What'd the estimate come in at on the foundation?" I said, $84,000. He said, "Lord?" I said, "The roof inspection came back worse than I let on, too. More like 2 years than 3. He said, "George." I said, I was honest with him about all of it. I told him up front. Warren laughed again. That same long, low laugh. He said, "I suppose you did." I heard from Marcus 6 weeks after I'd left Nashville. He called on a Wednesday evening, and his voice had a different quality than it had had in any of our previous conversations. Tighter. He said they had gotten the foundation assessment done, and it was, he said, more involved than they had expected. He said the contractor had found a secondary issue with the drainage on the east side that was contributing to the settling, and that the full remediation, between the structural work and the drainage correction and the section of flooring that had to come up, was going to run over 100,000. I said, "I'm sorry to hear that." He said, "Dad." He paused. He said, "Did you know it was that bad?" I said, "I told you the foundation needed to be addressed. I told you that before you took it." He said, Yeah, you did." There was a silence. I let it be a silence. He said, "Where are you anyway? Mom's family place?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Is it nice up there?" I said, "It's very nice. Quiet. Good air." He said, "That's good." He said it like a man who is trying to mean it and mostly succeeding. He said, "I'm glad you're somewhere good." I said, "How's Cassandra?" He said, "She's okay. Adjusting. It's been a complicated spring." I said, "I imagine." He said he had to go. He said he would call again soon. He said he loved me. I said I loved him too. That was true. It has always been true. Loving your children and seeing them clearly are not the same thing, and they do not cancel each other out. I've been in Harlan County for 4 months now. The farmhouse is in better shape than when I arrived. The new pump works well. The chimney is clean. The kitchen is rewired and the lights no longer flicker in the evening. I have been working on the front porch railing, which was soft in 2 sections, replacing the rails with oak I had milled from a fallen tree on the lower property. It's slow work, and I like slow work. Boyd introduced me to a man named Gerald who retired from underground mining 15 years ago and now builds furniture in a shop behind his house. We have had coffee twice. He showed me a chair he is making from sourwood, and the joinery was so clean it made me want to go home and look at my own work critically. I told him that. He seemed to appreciate it. In the mornings, I walk the property. I follow the fence lines down through the lower pasture and along the creek and up into the white oak stand on the north ridge. Ruth's grandfather planted 20 of those oaks from acorns. He collected the fall. He turned 50. Some of them are over 70 years old now. They are enormous. Standing under them is the closest thing to being inside a cathedral that I have experienced in a long time. I talk to Ruth sometimes, standing under those trees. I don't know if that's a thing people are supposed to do or not. I do it anyway. I tell her how the house is coming. I tell her about Boyd and Gerald and the way the creek sounds in the morning. I told her about the conversation with Marcus. I told her she was right about all of it. She usually is. The lease payment came in for the second quarter, direct deposit to the account that is now in my name. I looked at the number on the phone screen for a moment, and then I put my phone in my pocket and kept walking. The wind was moving across the ridge, and the turbines were turning in that slow, quiet way. And below me the valley was spread out, green and wide, and the sky above it was the particular blue that you only get in the mountains at a certain time of morning when the light is still low. I had been worried, after Ruth died, about whether I would know how to be a person without her. 41 years is a long time to build a life with someone, and it is a terrifying thing to try to imagine its shape without them in it. I had been worried that I would be hollow. I am not hollow. I am sad, in the deep, settled way. You are sad when you have lost something irreplaceable, and you know you are going to carry that loss with you for whatever years you have left. Not because it crushes you, but because it is part of you now. I am sad the way a house shows the weather it has been through in its wood and its angles, and the way the floors slope slightly toward the center. But I am standing. Ruth's books are on the shelves in the study. Her blue notebooks are stacked on the desk. Her quilt is on the bed, and her cast-iron skillet is on the stove, and her clay pot with the cracked handle is on the windowsill of the farmhouse kitchen, where the morning light comes through earliest and sits longest. I make coffee every morning, and I take it to the porch, and I look out at the land she loved, and I try to see it the way she saw it. I don't entirely succeed, but I am learning. Marcus called again 2 weeks ago, longer this time. More like the calls we used to have before all of this started, before his mother died, and the other version of him arrived at my kitchen table with a legal pad. He asked about the house, about what I was working on, about whether I had met any people up in the county. He asked about the land. I told him about the oaks. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Mom always talked about those trees." I said, "I know she did." He said, "I never went up there. I should have gone." I said, "You can still go. Anytime you want." He said, "Really?" I said, "It's your mother's land, Marcus. You're always welcome here." He didn't say anything for a second. I could hear something shift in his breathing. He said, "Okay." He said, "Maybe this fall." I said, "This fall is a good time. The leaves turn later up here than you'd expect." He said he'd think about it. I believe he will come. I believe he is. In whatever slow and painful way that people who have done something they are not proud of manage it, trying to find his way back to a version of himself that his mother would have recognized. I do not know if he will get there. I know that I am not going to make it harder than it has to be. I am 66 years old, and I have good tools and good land and enough money to live carefully and well for the rest of my life. I have a friend in Warren who will talk to me honestly, and a neighbor in Gerald who understands wood the way I understand it, and the company of a place that the woman I loved for 41 years loved first, which is a kind of inheritance I did not know how to name until I was living inside it. Some evenings I sit in the study and I read. I have started working through Ruth's shelves systematically, from left to right, taking whatever she left there. Last week I read a novel she had marked up in pencil, her small, precise handwriting in the margins, her private conversation with a book she had read alone. I read her notes as carefully as I read the text. I am still learning things about her. I think I will be learning things about her for the rest of my life. The creek is louder in the evenings. It has a sound at dusk that is different from any other time of day, lower and steadier, like something settling in for the night. I can hear it from the porch if the wind is quiet. Tonight the wind is quiet. I pour my coffee. I sit in the chair her grandfather made. I listen to the water,